All right, let's dive into something pretty amazing that we do all day, every day without even thinking about it. Breathing.
Sounds simple enough, right?
Well, we've got Dr. Rasha Eldeeb's notes on respiration regulation here, and let me tell you, it gets a lot more complex than you'd think.
Oh, absolutely. Way more going on than just inhaling and exhaling.
So the big surprise for me was learning that we don't just have one system controlling our breath. We've got TWO.
Like having a backup generator you didn't even know was there.
Right. One we control and one, well, it seems to control itself.
Pretty neat design, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Okay, so I know I can hold my breath for a bit, but I can't hold it forever. Eventually I have to come up for air. That's me using the system I control.
Exactly. Your cerebral cortex is in charge there, but it's got limits.
Because otherwise I could just hold my breath forever and turn blue.
Well, not quite. The automatic system steps in before you get to that point. It's designed to prevent you from passing out. A safety mechanism, you could say.
So where is this other system hiding? Some secret control room in my body.
It's actually located in your brainstem, a region called the respiratory center, and it's really critical.
Critical how?
Well, imagine severe damage to that area, say from a spinal injury. That can actually cause breathing to stop completely.
Wow, that's intense. Okay, so what makes this respiratory center so powerful? What's it doing exactly?
It's basically acting like an orchestra conductor. It coordinates all the muscles involved in breathing to make sure everything works in harmony.
And how does it do that?
It's got these specialized groups of neurons, some for inhaling, some for exhaling. They work together, sending signals back and forth to create the rhythm of your breath. A delicate dance, you could say.
Okay, so my brain is choreographing my breath every second of every day. Amazing. So what are the main players in this respiratory orchestra?
Let's start with the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG for short. It's located in the medulla. You can think of it like the first violinist initiating each breath you take.
Okay, got it. DRG is leading the charge. What else?
Now, here's a really interesting detail. The left side of your DRG actually controls the right side of your body's breathing muscles.
So this signals crossover.
Exactly. And the right side of your DRG controls the left side breathing muscles. Crisscross system. Isn't that intriguing?
Yeah, not what I expected at all.
And there's more. The neurons in the DRG, they have this unique firing pattern called a ramp rhythm. Basically, their activity slowly increases over a couple of seconds, then stops abruptly.
And that's what creates that inhale, pause, exhale thing we all do.
Precisely. That ramp rhythm determines both the depth and the rate of each breath.
So by changing how fast that ramp builds and how quickly it stops, that's how we control how deep or shallow and how fast or slow we're breathing.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that the whole system adapts to what your body needs. Think about exercise. Your breath gets faster and deeper, right?
Yeah, definitely. Hard to miss that.
Well, that's the ramp rhythm adjusting to supply your muscles with more oxygen.
So, like, my brain's got a built-in fitness tracker.
You could say that. Okay, now, ready for the next section of the orchestra?
Hit me.
We've got the ventral respiratory group, VRG, also in the medulla. Think of it like the brass section coming in.
Brass. So louder. More
Well,
powerful.
You got it. VRG mainly kicks in when you're doing what we call forced breathing. So like blowing out candles on a birthday cake.
We're singing karaoke, hopefully not off-key.
Exactly. And here's a key difference from the DRG. The VRG sends signals to both sides of the body, activating accessory breathing muscles. So it's giving you that extra oomph when you need it.
Cool. All right, so far so good. What else is going on up there in the brainstem?
Well, we can't forget about the conductors up in the pons, another part of the brainstem. These are what we call the pontine centers. They're fine-tuning your breathing rhythm, making sure it's smooth.
Okay, what are the pontine centers doing specifically?
Well, one of them is the pneumotaxic center, or PNC for short.
PNC, got it.
And think of the PNC like the brakes on your breath. It makes sure you don't just keep inhaling forever.
So without PNC, we just turn into human balloons.
Well, not exactly, but you get the idea. It puts the brakes on inspiration at regular intervals. Then there's the apneutic center, APC. That one acts like the gas pedal.
So PNC is the brake, APC is the gas. Got it.
Exactly. And the APC, it really gets going when carbon dioxide levels in your blood get high.
So it's like this constant push and pull between the two centers, the brake and the gas.
Exactly. And the PNC, the brake, it actually keeps the APC, the gas, in check.
Okay, so it's all about balance. But what happens if that balance gets thrown off?
Well, if the PNC gets damaged, for example, your breathing could become really slow and deep, almost like one long gasp, not very efficient.
All right, so these pontine centers are pretty important for keeping things running smoothly. Amazing how much is going on in my brainstem without me even knowing it.
It is. But now the question is, how does your body actually know when to adjust your breathing?
Yeah, good question. What's triggering those changes?
Well, we've got two main mechanisms at play here: chemical regulation and non-chemical regulation. Basically, your body's using both chemical signals and other types of signals to figure out how fast and deep you need to breathe.
Okay, a communication network.
Exactly. And it's pretty complex. Let's start with the chemical side of things.
All right, the chemical messengers, what are we talking about here?
We've got these amazing little sensors called chemoreceptors, and there are two main types: central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors.
Okay, central and peripheral. Got
The
it.
central ones are located in your medulla. They're constantly monitoring, like little guards.
Monitoring what? What are they looking out for?
Well, think of them like CO2 detectors. They're constantly checking the levels of CO2 in your brain. Actually, what they're really responding to are hydrogen ions.
Hydrogen ions, like chemistry class.
Yeah. You see, when CO2 reacts with water, it forms these hydrogen ions. So the central chemoreceptors are really measuring those hydrogen ions as a way to indirectly measure CO2 levels. It's a bit of a chemical puzzle, but it works.
Wow, my brain is doing chemistry to figure out if I need to breathe. That's amazing.
Isn't it? Now, the peripheral chemoreceptors, they're hanging out in your neck and near your heart, and they're mainly focused on oxygen levels.
Okay, so they're like the oxygen police, making sure I don't run out.
You could say that. They're like the body's early warning system, sounding the alarm if oxygen levels drop too low.
The lifeguards of the respiratory system. Got it.
Exactly. And here's a really cool fact. These peripheral chemoreceptors, they have an incredibly high blood flow, like 20 times higher than the brain.
Whoa, seriously. Why so high?
It allows them to pick up on even the tiniest changes in oxygen levels. They're super sensitive and super fast.
Okay, so they're like those high-speed cameras they use in sports replays, catching every detail. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. But when do these peripheral chemoreceptors become, like, the main drivers of breathing? When do they take over?
Well, they step up when the central chemoreceptors aren't working at full capacity.
When would that happen?
Think about situations like anesthesia, or when CO2 levels are abnormally low.
Low CO2 levels. When would that happen?
That can happen after you voluntarily hyperventilate.
So they're like the backup singers, ready to jump in when the lead vocalist needs a break.
Perfect analogy. It's this incredible teamwork between central and peripheral chemoreceptors that makes sure our breathing is always in sync with what our body needs.
Mind blown. So we've got this amazing dual control system in the brain stem. We've got these chemical sensors providing constant feedback. But you said there were non-chemical signals too, right?
Absolutely. These add a whole other layer of complexity to this communication network we're talking about.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, some of the most fascinating ones come from your lungs themselves.
Wait, my lungs are sending messages too. What are they saying?
Picture this. You've got these tiny sensors called pulmonary stretch receptors embedded right in the smooth muscle of your airways.
And what are they sensing?
They're monitoring how much your lungs are stretching. They're like little alarm bells going off when your lungs get too full.
Okay, so they're keeping me from, like, overinflating.
Exactly. It's called the Herring-Brewer reflex. It prevents you from overinflating your lungs, which can be really important during exercise.
Okay, that's one message from the lungs. What else are they saying?
We've also got lung irritant receptors.
Irritant receptors.
And as the name suggests, they get triggered by anything irritating. Smoke, dust, you name it, even cold air sometimes.
So those are the reason I start coughing when I walk into a smoky room.
You got it. And they don't just trigger coughing, they cause your breathing to get faster and shallower, and they tighten up your airways, all to minimize your exposure to whatever's irritating them.
Wow, my lungs are saying, hey, brain, get us out of here.
Exactly. They're pretty clever, those lungs. Now we have one more type of messenger from the lungs, the J receptors.
J receptors, what are those triggered by?
Pulmonary congestion?
Pulmonary congestion, so like fluid in the lungs.
Exactly. And when these J receptors are activated, they can cause a whole bunch of changes. Your breathing gets rapid and shallow, your heart rate slows down, your blood pressure drops.
They're like a distress signal.
You got it. It's your body saying, hey, something's not right here.
Okay, so we've got these messengers coming from the lungs. Anything else?
Oh yeah, we're just getting started with the non-chemical regulation. We've also got signals coming from your upper airways, your muscles and joints, even your cardiovascular system.
My brain is starting to hurt. But all right, tell me, what kinds of messages are these other parts of my body sending?
Well, from the upper airways, we have those irritant receptors again.
Okay, so more coughing and spluttering.
Yeah, but those irritant receptors also trigger another couple of reflexes that I bet you're familiar with: sneezing and coughing.
Ugh, So even those annoying reflexes have a purpose.
Oh, absolutely. Sneezing helps expel irritants from your nose,
Mhm.
and coughing does the same for your airways.
All right, so they're actually our friends, even if they are a bit disruptive sometimes.
What about muscles and joints? What's their role in all of this?
Well, think about it. When you start exercising, your breathing increases even before you start to feel out of breath, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, that's because you've got these sensors in your muscles and joints called proprioceptors, and they're sending signals to your brainstem saying, hey, we're about to start moving. We're going to need more oxygen. It's all about anticipation.
So, like, my body is predicting the future of my workout.
You could say that.
Hmm.
And then we can't forget about the cardiovascular system. There's a constant crosstalk going on between your blood pressure, special sensors called baroreceptors, and your breathing rate.
Crosstalk. Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine your blood pressure drops suddenly. Your baroreceptors sense this and immediately signal your respiratory center to increase your breathing rate. That helps bring your blood pressure back up.
So breathing can actually help regulate my blood pressure.
That's pretty cool.
It can, yes. And then there are even more fascinating connections. Have you ever heard of adrenaline apnea?
Adrenaline apnea, that sounds intense.
It's actually pretty common.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed that after a sudden fright or a surge of adrenaline, your breathing momentarily stops?
Now that you mention it, yeah, I think I have.
That's adrenaline apnea. Your body's just taking a quick pause while it figures out what to do next.
Wow, it's like my body forgets to breathe for a second.
It's a fascinating response, and it just shows how interconnected everything really is. But we're not done yet. We also have to consider signals coming from your other organs and even from higher brain centers.
Seriously, even more.
Oh, yeah, it's a big party in there. Things like swallowing, vomiting, hiccups, yawns, it can all impact your breathing.
Swallowing and vomiting, okay, I get that. But hiccups and yawns, those seem so random.
They do, but they just go to show how seemingly unrelated actions can influence this vital process. And then we have the higher brain centers like the motor cortex and limbic system.
Right, the parts of my brain that do the thinking and the feeling. How do those get involved?
Well, your motor cortex is what gives you conscious control over your breath. You can decide to hold your breath, take a deep breath, change the pace of your breathing.
Right, but we already talked about how that control has its limits.
Exactly. Eventually, the automatic system takes over. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that we have this ability to consciously intervene?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So the tug of war between my mind and my body.
A great way to put it. And your limbic system, which processes emotions, that plays a role too. Have you ever noticed how you sigh when you're stressed or content? Or how your breath gets all shallow and rapid when you're anxious?
Wow, yeah, now that you mention it.
It's like your breath is a window into your inner state.
I never realized how connected my emotions and breathing are.
It's pretty amazing, and even your body temperature can influence your breathing. When your temperature goes up, your respiratory center gets stimulated, and your breathing rate increases.
Okay, so whether I'm consciously controlling it or not, my breathing is being adjusted by all these signals coming from all over my body.
Exactly. It's this beautifully orchestrated system, constantly making sure you have the oxygen you need, no matter what you're doing or how you're feeling.
Incredible. I've gone from barely thinking about breathing to being totally amazed by it.
It's a hidden world inside all of us.
It is. Okay, so we've explored the dual control systems, the intricate web of chemical and non-chemical regulators, the interplay between conscious and automatic control. It's a lot to take in. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to circle back to those chemoreceptors for a second.
Those little chemical messengers.
Yeah, they seem so important, like they're really fine-tuning our every breath. Can you just remind me again, what's each type of receptor primarily sensitive to?
Sure. So the central chemoreceptors, those are the ones in your medulla, they're mainly sensitive to changes in CO2 levels. Or, more precisely, they're responding to the hydrogen ions produced when CO2 reacts with water in the cerebrospinal fluid.
Right, so they're indirectly sensing the CO2 levels through those hydrogen ions.
Exactly. Now, the peripheral chemoreceptors, they're mainly sensitive to low oxygen levels. They're the ones that really kick in when things get critical. But they can also respond to high CO2, high hydrogen ions, and even high potassium levels.
Wow, they're multitaskers.
They are. So how do they all work together? Well, under normal circumstances, the central chemoreceptors are the main players, constantly monitoring CO2 levels and making tiny adjustments to keep them within a narrow range. They're like the thermostat for your breathing.
Okay, I like that, the thermostat.
keeping things running smoothly. Now, those peripheral chemoreceptors, they become more important when oxygen levels drop significantly, like when you're at high altitudes.
Or if I have lung disease or something.
Exactly. And they're also important when CO2 levels are abnormally low, like after you've been hyperventilating. In those cases, the central chemoreceptors might not be stimulated enough to keep you breathing properly, so the peripheral chemoreceptors step in. It's a remarkable partnership.
It really is. So we've got these chemoreceptors, but what about all those non-chemical regulators we talked about? Do those work with the chemoreceptors?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think of it as a multi-layered control system. The non-chemical regulators, they add another layer of fine-tuning based on things like lung stretch, muscle movement, even emotional state. It's like a giant control panel with inputs coming from all over your body.
It's amazing. This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I never realized just how complex breathing is.
It's something we often take for granted, but it's truly a vital process, and the more we understand it, the better equipped we are to take care of our respiratory health.
Speaking of respiratory health, you mentioned that certain medical conditions can disrupt this whole automatic control of breathing.
Right, like Ondine's curse.
Ondine's curse. That sounds serious.
It is. It's a rare condition where the automatic breathing mechanisms malfunction, often because of damage to the brainstem. People with this condition, they literally have to consciously remember to breathe, especially when they're sleeping.
Wow. So it's like every breath is a conscious decision. That must be exhausting.
It is, and it highlights just how vital that automatic breathing system is.
Absolutely. Are there any other conditions that can disrupt breathing?
Well, sleep apnea is a big one. It affects millions of people.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that when your breathing stops and starts while you're sleeping?
Exactly. The most common type is obstructive sleep apnea, where the airway gets blocked, usually because the throat muscles relax too much during sleep.
Ah, so that's what causes all that snoring.
Yep. And then there's central sleep apnea, where the problem isn't a blocked airway, but a problem with the brain signaling to the respiratory muscles. So the brain basically forgets to tell the body to breathe.
That sounds kind of scary.
It can be, yes.
Oh,
And it can be caused by a bunch of different things, underlying medical conditions, medications, even being at high altitude.
wow. So many things can affect our breathing. This is way more complex than I ever imagined.
But it's fascinating, isn't it?
Totally. This whole deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for my respiratory system. It's amazing how much is going on behind the scenes to keep us alive.
It really is a remarkable system.
Okay, so we've explored these control systems, the regulators, the chemical messengers. It's incredible. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a bit of a thought-provoking question.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So we've seen how robust this automatic breathing system is, all these layers of control, backup mechanisms. It's truly remarkable.
Hmm.
But what happens in those rare cases where this system fails? Like an Ondine's curse, where you have to consciously will yourself to breathe every single breath.
That's a profound question.
It makes you realize just how much we take for granted, doesn't it? Every breath is a gift.
It is.
And maybe it's a reminder for all of us to pay a little more attention to our breath, appreciate that silent rhythm that keeps us alive.
Beautifully said. It really is amazing how we just go about our day and we never really think about all the things that are going on behind the scenes.
Right, to keep us breathing.
Yeah.
So we've already uncovered so much about this like hidden world of breathing regulation, and I'm ready to go even deeper.
Let's do it.
You mentioned earlier that our brains play a role in controlling our breath, like consciously.
Right, yeah.
So let's talk more about that.
Absolutely. So while our automatic system is keeping things running smoothly in the background, our cerebral cortex gives us a certain degree of control over our breathing.
Okay, the cerebral cortex, that's like the outer layer of the brain, right?
Exactly, yeah, the thinking part of the brain, you could say. And it allows us to do things like, consciously hold our breath or take a deep breath when we're feeling stress.
Right, like I can decide to take a deep breath right now. But we also talked about how that conscious control has limits.
Right.
So why is that?
Think of it this way. Your cortex can initiate these voluntary actions, but ultimately it's the brainstem that has the final say. It's like having a driver's license, but only being allowed to drive in certain areas.
So the brainstem's like the ultimate driving instructor.
Exactly. The brainstem is constantly monitoring input from those chemical and non-chemical sensors we talked about, adjusting your breathing based on what your body needs, regardless of what your cortex is trying to do.
Okay, that makes sense. We talked about voluntary hyperventilation earlier,
Uh-huh.
and I've always wondered, like, how does that actually work? Can you walk me through it?
Yeah, definitely. So when you voluntarily hyperventilate, you're basically forcing yourself to breathe faster and deeper than your body needs.
Right.
This causes you to exhale more carbon dioxide than you're producing, leading to a drop in CO2 levels in your blood.
And if I remember correctly, those central chemoreceptors in the medulla are very sensitive to CO2 levels.
Exactly. So when CO2 levels drop, the central chemoreceptors send weaker signals to the respiratory center, and that decreases the drive to breathe.
So my brain is basically saying we've got plenty of oxygen, we can take a break from breathing for a bit.
Yeah, something like that. But here's where things get really interesting. As you hold your breath, your oxygen levels start to decline, while carbon dioxide levels gradually rise again.
So eventually that urge to breathe becomes too strong to resist.
Precisely. And those peripheral chemoreceptors we talked about, the ones that are sensitive to low oxygen levels, they start sending urgent signals to the brainstem saying, hey, we need more oxygen over here.
Okay, so it's like this tug of war going on between different signals.
Exactly. And eventually, the signals from the peripheral chemoreceptors, they win. They override the suppressed signals from the central chemoreceptors, forcing you to take that big gasp of air.
So that's why I can never hold my breath for very long after I hyperventilate.
Right. Your body's own safety mechanisms are kicking in. And often, because you've overcorrected your CO2 levels during hyperventilation, you end up in this weird cycle of alternating apnea and breathing. It's called periodic breathing.
So like my body is trying to find that sweet spot where everything is in balance again.
Exactly. And it's just another example of the incredible resilience of our respiratory control system.
It really is amazing how much is going on inside our bodies
Yeah.
without us even realizing it. This whole deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for my respiratory system.
I know, it's fascinating.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, the conditions that can disrupt breathing regulation.
Right.
We talked about Ondine's curse,
Right.
which sounds very scary.
It is a very serious condition.
It's hard to imagine what it must be like to have to remember to breathe.
Yeah, consciously remember to breathe, especially when you're sleeping.
Right.
It really underscores the importance of, continued research into these rare respiratory disorders.
Absolutely. We also talked about sleep apnea, which I know affects millions of people.
Mhm.
Can you remind us about the different types of sleep apnea?
Yeah, definitely. So obstructive sleep apnea, that's the most common type. It happens when your airway becomes blocked during sleep, usually because the muscles in your throat relax too much.
So that's what's causing that like classic snoring sound.
Exactly. And then you have central sleep apnea, which is less common, and it's caused by a problem with the brain's signaling to the respiratory muscles. Basically, the brain intermittently forgets to send the signal to breathe.
So it's like the communication lines between the brain and the respiratory system get cut off.
Yeah, something like that. And it can be associated with a variety of things, like underlying medical conditions, medications, even exposure to high altitude.
It seems like there are so many different factors that can impact our breathing.
There are both internal and external factors, but thankfully, researchers are constantly learning more about these factors and developing new treatments for a wide range of respiratory conditions.
That's good to hear. Are there any particular advancements in respiratory care that you're excited about?
One area that's really generating a lot of buzz is the development of non-invasive ventilation techniques.
Non-invasive ventilation.
Yeah, basically they use masks or nasal prongs to deliver gentle air pressure, which helps people with breathing difficulties breathe easier and more comfortably.
That sounds a lot more pleasant than those traditional ventilators, which I imagine can be pretty invasive.
Oh, absolutely. Non-invasive ventilation is a game changer for many people with conditions like sleep apnea, COPD, even neuromuscular disorders.
It's amazing how technology is always evolving to improve our lives. Any other cool developments on the horizon?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of research being done on gene therapy right now.
Gene therapy, that's where they're trying to actually correct the underlying genetic causes of diseases, right?
Exactly, and it has huge potential for treating a wide range of disorders, including respiratory disorders like cystic fibrosis.
That's incredible. It sounds like there's a lot of hope for people with respiratory conditions.
There is, and as we continue to unravel the mysteries of breathing regulation, we'll undoubtedly discover even more effective treatments and therapies.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I've learned a whole new level of understanding and appreciation for this, really intricate system that keeps us alive.
It's been my pleasure to share this journey with you.
I'm curious to explore even more about breathing. I remember at the beginning we talked about how there are two systems controlling our breath. We talked a lot about the automatic system, but I'd love to hear more about the system we can control.
I think it's time we took a closer look at the role of the cerebral cortex.
That's that amazing outer layer of our brain, the one that's responsible for all our conscious thoughts and decisions,
Right. It's time to explore the power of voluntary breathing.
and how we can harness that power for our well-being.
Exactly.
Sounds fascinating. Can't wait to delve into the conscious side of breathing and how we can actually use it to our advantage. Stay tuned, listeners, as we continue our deep dive into the amazing world of breathing regulation. Welcome back to our deep dive into breathing regulation. It's been quite a journey so far, wouldn't you say?
It really has. From the brainstem to those amazing chemoreceptors who knew there was so much going on.
Right. I feel like I'm seeing my own breath in a whole new light. And now I'm really curious to explore the conscious side of breathing.
The role of the cerebral cortex.
Exactly. We've touched on it a bit, but I'd love to dive deeper into how our thoughts, our intentions, can actually influence our breath.
It's a fascinating area. While that automatic system's chugging along in the background, our cerebral cortex gives us a certain degree of control.
Right. I know I can consciously decide to hold my breath or take a deep breath, especially when I'm feeling stressed.
Exactly. But we also talked about how that conscious control, it has limits.
Right, like I can't just decide to stop breathing forever.
Thankfully, no. Think of it this way. Your cortex can make suggestions, but it's ultimately the brainstem, that more primitive part of the brain, that has the final say.
So my cortex is like, what, a guest in the control room?
A good analogy. The brainstem's the one constantly monitoring those sensors, the feedback loops, making sure everything's running smoothly. It's not going to let you just shut the whole system down.
Okay, so it's a balance, my conscious intentions, and the automatic wisdom of my body.
Exactly.
And it's a good example of that.
What's that?
Voluntary hyperventilation.
Ah, yes. That's a great example.
We talked about how, forcing ourselves to breathe really fast and deep, it can mess up that balance of CO2 and oxygen in our bodies.
Right.
And then we end up with that period of apnea where we're not breathing at all.
Exactly. By hyperventilating, we're overriding the automatic system settings, suppressing that urge to breathe.
It's like we're hitting the mute button on our body's natural rhythm.
I like that, the mute button. But the automatic system's smart. It always kicks back in to restore balance.
Right, that's why we can't hold our breath forever, even after we've been hyperventilating. Our bodies know what they're doing.
They do. Those peripheral chemoreceptors sense those oxygen levels dropping, and they send those urgent signals to the brainstem, like, hey, we need air over here.
And those signals, they override everything else that's going on.
Exactly. It's a safety mechanism.
It's amazing the interplay between our conscious control and, the power of these automatic systems.
It is, and it really highlights how interconnected our minds and bodies are. Our thoughts, emotions, intentions, they can actually influence our physiology, our breathing.
It's like our breath is a bridge between those two worlds, the conscious and the subconscious.
Beautiful way to put it. And as we learn more about this connection, we can actually start to explore ways to use our breath to our advantage.
Ooh, okay, I like where this is going.
Hmm.
How can we use our breath to improve our health and well-being?
Well, for centuries, practices like yoga, meditation, tai chi,
Yeah.
they've all used conscious breathing techniques.
Right. To relax, to reduce stress, to improve focus.
Exactly. And now science is catching up, starting to understand why these practices work. Studies are showing that deep, slow breathing, it can activate the parasympathetic nervous system.
Okay, and the parasympathetic nervous system, that's the one that's responsible for the rest and digest response, right?
Exactly. It's like flipping a switch from fight or flight to rest and recharge.
I can definitely feel that when I take a few deep breaths, like my whole body just relaxes.
Right. And that relaxation, it has a cascade of positive effects. Slows your heart rate, lowers your blood pressure, reduces those stress hormones.
Wow, it's incredible that something as simple as changing our breathing pattern can have such a big impact.
It really is. And researchers are now exploring how to use these breathing techniques to help people with all sorts of conditions: anxiety, insomnia, even chronic pain.
Really. That's amazing. It seems like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
I think so too. It's a really exciting area of research.
Well, this whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've gone from the depths of the brainstem to the heights of the cerebral cortex, exploring the mechanics of our breath, the conscious and the unconscious.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've learned about the power we have with each inhale and exhale.
Each breath, A miracle.
It really is. And for those of you listening who want to keep exploring this amazing world of breath, we'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
Yes, lots of great resources out there.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, remember, every breath is a gift. It's a testament to the power and resilience of our bodies.
Take a moment to appreciate that silent rhythm that sustains us all.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.